Welcome into the Irish NFL show as we continue our look at the NFC conference. In this particular episode, we are going to focus on the NFC East, a division close to my heart. Before we kick off, just want to welcome our host, Colin Cronin, the CNC now. We used to have an M&M, now it's CNC. It's Colin Cronin and Conor Brophy. Guys, great to have you here again today.
Thanks, Brian. CNC Football Factory.
Yeah, we're another step closer to proper regular season football, Brian, which is always good. The sooner that arrives, the better.
And before we start, I just want to say, Conor, we had a fantastic reaction to you being on the show last week. The podcast numbers and people were very, complimentary of the show last week, and obviously you've been involved, so it's great. That's great to hear as well.
That's all down to you guys and how warmly welcomed and propped up I was last week. Very, very flattered to hear that. That's great.
Right, we'll crack on NFC East and the Commanders. We're going to start with the Commanders because they are a precarious one in a way, because I suppose their season and I suppose their off season has been overshadowed by the takeover. You know, I said to Colin when we were in Arizona, I generally couldn't see a scenario how Ron Rivera would still be the coach of this team if it wasn't for all the stuff that's going on off the field. And they haven't done a huge amount in the off season in terms of free agency acquisition, kind of locked up some of their key players. And obviously Howell has been confirmed as the quarterback. And a lot of people were surprised that they weren't in the sweepstakes for a number of quarterbacks, but they seem comfortable with what they believe they've seen for him in practice of last season, and obviously the game which he played in the final week of the season for them to progress with him. I'll come to you first, Colin. Are you surprised initially if they didn't go after a quarterback? I know they have had a little bit of a quarterback merry-go-round with Taylor Heineke now moving on to Atlanta, but they didn't really do anything in that situation. They're confident with Sam Howell.
Well, I think, Brian, the new owner probably played a big factor in that. You know, we all know about Dan Schneider and his horrific stewardship of the Washington Commanders, both on and off the field. And I can't imagine he was willing to shell out, because the money, we all know, like essentially that a lot of the money essentially either has to be paid up front or held in escrow. So it would have been his money, and he wasn't going to do that. In terms of how, look, he was a decent college QB, and he was probably a better college QB potentially than Kenny Pickett. Now, that's not to say he'll go on to have a better NFL career, but we just don't know. And so I can understand, I suppose, them rolling the dice, especially with the new owners coming in. It allows them to get a season under their belt before they have to make a decision. You don't want to end up in a situation like the Waltons, where you have a QB with a $250 million contract and it's something of an albatross around their neck. So I think for that reason, it probably, makes sense. And they will have weapons there. They did get the contract done with Scary Terry. And look, this is kind of a tread water season. There could be huge changes, both, in the front office and in the head coach this time next year. And obviously Chase Young is the other one. At the time of recording, he was out on the field today, a brace on the knee. But I don't know, does he feel confident in playing on it? He's never looked the same ever since the surgery. So that's the big question mark, I think, going into this season alongside the quarterback.
Conor, Eric Bieniemy has come in as the offensive coordinator. A number of changes across the division. It's an interesting one, bearing in mind his relationship in Kansas City. And we saw at times it looked like his relationship with Patrick Mahomes was starting to dwindle a little bit towards the end. And there was always a conversation that we're going to go Andy Reid was the one essentially doing all the play calling, albeit he was the offensive coordinator. He's going to get a fresh look at it in Washington. You were thinking he'd have full ownership of the offense.
Yeah, and you mentioned the key word there, which is play caller. And we've seen this happen before, and you're always slightly nervous when a guy goes from that OC position where he's not the chief play caller into a position where suddenly the spotlight falls on him. And that can go in either direction. I'm a Bears fan here, and I'm scarred by the Matt Nagy experience, when it turned out that despite being from the Andy Reid coaching tree, he wasn't the next beautiful offensive mind, or at least couldn't translate that into the plays he was calling on the field. And we've also seen Nathaniel Hackett make the transition to the Seattle Seahawks, and that didn't work out too well either. Like it's one thing to be the OC, it's another thing to call the plays, and it doesn't always translate. Now, set against that, Bieniemy's a long time waiting to get this shot, and it's great that he's actually the deputy head coach as well, I think, isn't he? That's the position they've given him. Otherwise, they couldn't have poached him quite as easily, so they needed to give him the bump up. A lot of controversy over the years as to why it was that Bieniemy never got that head coaching job. Never mind, the gig that he's got in the Washington Commanders. And unfortunately, given the history of the NFL and the history of black head coaches in the NFL, there's been a lot of comments on that as well, particularly when you consider some of the other people who got their shots at times when they wouldn't have had anything like the glittering CV that Bieniemy had. So I think a lot of people will be hoping that does take off for Washington next year, even though, all being clear, being honest, it's not the greatest slot in the world, right? For all the reasons the column has just outlined. We've seen the Snyderverse implode, and unlike its movie counterpart, we won't be seeing any fan campaign for it to be reinstalled anytime soon. It's probably the last chance saloon for Riverboat Ron, who, I think is something of a fan favorite well outside Washington, and he deserves better than this. You look at where the Commanders finished up last year. You're 8-8-1 in what is arguably the toughest, or was the toughest division in football last year. Sent 3 teams to the playoff, and they were still right in with a shout right to the end of the season without anything like the talent that the 2 of the teams ahead of them in that division, the Cowboys and the Eagles, had to call on. So he's done a good job there without a huge amount of help, with all this off-season and off-field turmoil, which obviously hasn't helped from the recruitment perspective. They're kind of stalled in a bit of a strange holding pattern here. Clearly didn't want to make a big move in the draft. Not necessarily a free agent friendly zone for any quarterbacks that were available. Like, who would want to go into that situation not knowing who the GM, who the head coach are going to be next season, not knowing what the new ownership are going to want to do? And as you say, Colin, they don't necessarily want to be in a situation where they've handed out a massive contract, and then new owners come in and have really different ideas about how they want to run the franchise. So you'd expect the Commanders to be competitive as it goes, because players played for Ron Rivera. He's your classic football guy. He's the kind of guy that players want to play for, and he does get results. We've seen the Dan Campbell show for the last couple of seasons. Ron Rivera has been that guy for years, and you'd expect them to go out and play hard as they always do, but they're up against it.
Talking about contracts there, Darren Payne, massive player, defensive tackle for them, got the big contract in the off-season column, and then they go 4th round cornerback, 2nd round cornerback. So are you looking at this team essentially thinking, if we can shore up our defense, we'd have a chance with the offense in which we have? Because they have brought in some good players over the course of the last few years from the rookie class that have done quite well offensively. Is it defense where the biggest work is needed, do you think?
I suppose if you go back a few years ago, it was defense that they kind of shone on. And ever since then, they've had the struggles on offense, but they probably needed to retool. And we know that, look, the trench warfare is key in any across all the divisions, but possibly particularly this division. This division has such a kind of a storied history. Like, go back when I first started watching it, the NFC East in the late 80s, early 90s was the division. You generally, you came through this and you won the Super Bowl. And the Washington Commanders were serious business back in the 80s, and they wanted to get back there. And I think probably for them, they probably looked at where they were in this particular draft, and it made sense. And we've talked about it a number of times before, Brian. We seem to be in something of a golden age for young cornerbacks. So maybe they're hoping to take advantage of that. And they've also had a bit of success recently with guys who are maybe on the smaller side. If you go Dotson last year, a guy who would have been, not your kind of typical size for a wide receiver, but he had a lot of success, and maybe they're trying to replicate that again in terms of some of their choices in the backfield.
Yeah, and if Howell doesn't work out, they obviously have Jacoby Brissett, who they signed the free agent to step in and take on that familiar role, which he seems to have had over the past few years, which is to back up with an opportunity to play during the season. think the Commanders right now are a bit of an up and down situation, and we're not entirely sure what we'll see from them come September. Week 1 against the Cardinals, I'd imagine they'll be happy with that game and look to kick off the season with a win. Moving on